Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to New Books in Latin American Studies, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. I am your host, Lisette Baron Carvajal. Today, I will be talking to Drs. Diego Armus and Pablo Gomez about their wonderful edited book titled The Gray Zones of Medicine, Healers and History in Latin America, published by University of Pittsburgh Press in 2021. Welcome, Diego and Pablo. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Lisette.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's start by talking about your personal trajectories. Our listeners will love to hear you talk about your background. Why did you decide to study history? Where are you currently working? How you came to your chosen region of study, and tell us more about perhaps your research interest. So please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. I'm Argentinian. I was born in Buenos Aires. I got my first degree in history at the University of Buenos Aires and a second degree at the University of California at Berkeley. In Buenos Aires, besides teaching, I was working at the Center for Urban and Regional Studies. At that institution, I was mainly focused on issues related to housing of the poor, and immigration and labor history, basically in turn of the century Buenos Aires and Rosario, the second city in Argentina. At Berkeley, I got very interested on the history of disease from a social and cultural perspective. I was not particularly attracted by the history of medicine per se, but more on these social and cultural dimensions of diseases, pathologies, and medicine. I would say that I discovered this interest after reading Susan Sontag, Rosenberg, Richard Evans, among others. I'm still very interested in the city, as a very promissory site to write history. I continue to be very interested and committed to work on diseases and health, but I would say that I consider myself, by and large, an urban social historian. I teach at Swarthmore, but I go overseas frequently, offering graduate seminars and undergraduate seminars, especially in Latin American universities. I would say that by design, on purpose, I try to live a life with one leg in New York City, where I live, and the other one on Latin America.
All right, so I guess I will go now. Thank you very much, Lisette, for inviting us and to talk about our book. And it is really a pleasure being here and being with Diego Armus, whom I have read for a long time and who I greatly admire. I came to feel, actually, from the other direction that Diego came to it. I was first a physician. I trained as a physician in Colombia as an orthopedic surgeon. And I came initially to the States not to do history, but to work on oncology in orthopedic surgery, with the idea of going back as an oncologist and orthopedic surgeon to Colombia. But in the process, I reconnected with an area that I had been interested in throughout my life, which is histories and philosophies of science and medicine. And I was fortunate enough to get into grad school at Vanderbilt, and where I initially came with the idea of a project that looked at the intersections between economic history, the histories of industry in medical implants, and the histories of medicine. And I ended up actually working on a project on the history of ideas about the body related to the African diaspora in the Caribbean. And that transition has to do with my own development throughout grad school. And I think this is something that it is common to many of us. And as Diego is saying, right, like it changes as you go through both your studies, as you encounter different themes and topics, but more largely, I think that one common theme to my own trajectory is my interest in studying understandings of corporality and how they relate to the making of our own understandings of the world around us. So, and in that regard, I think that fits well with what what I've been doing over the past 10 years and my current projects. I'm right now working at the University of Wisconsin Madison. And as Diego, I'm also somebody who has ongoing projects in several parts, in both in Latin America and in other parts of the world, both with graduate students and colleagues. I'm part of Project Spark Recovery, and I'm very interested in ideas about the rethinking of what we consider to be global histories of science and medicine. So that is in kind of the very short version of the trajectories up to this point in my life, professional trajectories, I should say.
Wonderful. And it's so great I think it's wonderful that we get a sense of that trajectory. When I listen to this podcast, it's great to hear the varied ways in which people come to academia. So maybe now, because you have mentioned a little bit of your previous work, I would love if you could elaborate a little bit more, especially because the chapters that you both wrote for this book are related to that research. And in particular, I'm thinking for the case of Diego, I'm thinking for the Alien City. And in Pablo's case, I'm thinking about the Experiential Caribbean. These are both very influential books in the field and wonderful books, so I recommend them to our listeners. So maybe can you tell us a little bit about those books and where they came from and what they're about?
So the Alien City. This is a book that somehow expresses my clear intention to deal with the biological dimensions of health and disease, in this case tuberculosis, but mainly with their social and cultural aspects. The point of departure of the book was that tuberculosis is more than the Koch bacillus. And that context is a crucial dimension to understand tuberculosis. In a way, for me, tuberculosis was a sort of excuse to deal with a broad set of issues. Of course, medicalization of the urban space and society, but also immigration. Buenos Aires is a city that by the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, received millions of immigrants. Industrialization, not an industrial city like, let's say, Manchester, but a city with industries. Leisure time and even soccer, the book has a chapter on soccer. But also other issues, expansion of social citizenship, unstable gender relations, and of course, doctors, patients, and the sick in general. Along with these issues of context, I was also very interested in treatments and the many caregivers who are not university diplomat doctors. So somehow my intention was to come up with what I call a total history of tuberculosis in Buenos Aires. Let me stress that I knew perfectly well that was an aspiration, that total history is no more than the horizon, but for me it was a very motivated horizon. The book deals with global and local dimensions of tuberculosis, but I would say that the local dimension predominates and the global is a sort of backdrop. I agree with many colleagues that the global dimension is extremely important. I'm totally aware of the global turn in history writing. But from the beginning, for me, was clear and it was very, very important to keep my focus on the local. It was a decision. Why so? Because with this aspiration of writing a total history of tuberculosis in Buenos Aires, I was totally convinced that the tension between the total and the global are many, almost mutually exclusionary. Very difficult to write total history when you are doing with the global dimension of this disease. On the other hand, the local and the total get along much, much better. It's possible at the local somehow to aspire to write this total history of, in this case, of tuberculosis. Again, that was an aspiration. Yeah, I know that there are many, many things that I was not able to address in the book. Among other things, because sources, are limited. And we know that we are not writing fiction. We somehow write using evidence. And on many issues that for me were extremely important in the agenda for this book, sources were not there. So I have to sacrifice extremely appealing questions, but I didn't have the evidence yet to address them. Intentionally, I decided to finish the book with arrival of antibiotics, somehow with this sort of medical novelty. The first cycle of modern tuberculosis in Buenos Aires was over.
So the Experiential Caribbean is a book that departs from, as I was mentioned before, my interest in evaluating how is that from an understanding of practices around corporality itself, we gain somehow, or we access a window into how people conceive of their worlds. And more than that, the Experiential Caribbean is also departs from specific interest in exploring worldviews and understandings of nature and the human body that go beyond the narratives that we have grown up with, and that have shaped the historiographies of science and medicine as spaces defined by Eurocentric or Euro-American defined narratives of the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, or process of exploitation, conflict, resistance to Europeans and their projects in the Americas, on the part especially of people on the receiving end of these colonial projects. So in many ways, the Experiential Caribbean is an attempt at creating or narrating how you can conceive of project, an intellectual project, even in the midst of slavery in the 17th century Caribbean, that does not depend on the tenets, right, like of the usual dynamics of center periphery or incorporation into a project that is still defined in Europe. Rather, it is trying to recover, and this is a little bit like what Diego is saying, right? Like with the limited sources that we have, how is that we can think of medicine and medical practices, in this case, healing practices, in the terms and with the concepts that the people of African descent had in the region, a space that the 17th century Caribbean that was not defined at all by the world of the plantation that would become normative in the 18th century, but rather a space that is not defined either by the white and black dichotomies or the enslaved, non-enslaved dichotomies that will become so common to talk about enslaved people in spaces in the 18th and 19th century in the region. By the late 17th century, especially in the Spanish Caribbean spaces, many people were actually free. They were manumitted. And it is in that space where these categories do not function that well of freedom, categories of what is African, what is of African origin, what is of European origin, that you see the emergence of these very, very rich words that I explored there with the very pragmatic, performative use of techniques with excellent results that depend, and this is kind of where the title comes from, on how these practices are experienced by the people from the Caribbean, how practitioners themselves base their knowledge and that creation of knowledge on something that it is akin to what is felt, what is sensed. Well, in this, I want to emphasize that the sense of being in the world is one that it is defined not by what we will consider to be the usual sensorial spaces of the 21st century, but rather by a world that came to your bodies or to 17th century people's bodies through different channels, and that included channels that were what we'll consider to be today spiritual in nature. So there are sort of intersections here between what in older historiographies we'll consider religious histories and medical and scientific histories, and what I believe are rather spaces, different ways of experiences the natural world and the body.
Wonderful. Just a glimpse of those two wonderful books that listeners, if you haven't read them, check them out. They're great. Now I would love us to talk about this book, right? We're here to talk about the gray zones of medicine. So you mentioned in the acknowledgments that the idea of this book came about after Diego gave a talk in Madison. So tell us more about that. Why did you come together to edit this book? What inspired you? What sparked your interest in this project? Did you know you wanted individual chapters to be biographies, or did you decide that along the way? How was the writing, editing process? Tell us a little bit about all of that.
So you're inviting us to talk about the intimacy of the book, yeah?
Yes.
So, as you said, I went to Madison to talk about smoking in Buenos Aires, one of my current projects, cigarette smoking, yeah? And when the talk was over, with Pablo, we began to exchange impressions about the state of the historiography of medicine, science, health, and disease. And being Pablo a historian of the colonial period, and myself one of modern Latin America, we began to identify, to see emphasis, perspectives, approaches with plenty of limitations, independently of the period, be, let's say, mid-20th century or the 17th century. Yeah. And one of these problematic issues, rarely mentioned in the historiography, is that of continuity. The fact that health and disease issues cannot be discussed only and exclusively as medical problems with the diplomate doctors at the very center. Both in colonial and modern times, las artes de curar, as we say it in Spanish, the ways of healing in English, perhaps this is one way to translate artes de curar. Both in colonial and modern times, included many other practitioners besides medical doctors. And we were not talking about, let's say, the stereotypical curandero, but practitioners who circulated on the margins, inside and outside the realm of diplomate medicine. So we began to imagine this book addressing this main problem: how to deal with these margins, how to deal with this gray zone. Pablo, maybe you want to add.
Yeah, and thank you. Yeah, thank you, Diego. And I will also say, right, that before I get into kind of answering specifically the question, that one of the great things about the project is it has been very, very easy to work with Diego on this, and partially is because from the go, this is a project that starts as a conversation, as como se dice en español, un toma y dame, right? Like give and take. That it didn't have one specific or one unique outcome, kind of somehow inscribed in our minds at the beginning. And because it was conversational, this is true of the way in which the project evolved. It became something that really linked and invited, and I think that is the way in which the project ends up being something that is much more coherent in nature, paradoxically, because it allows, right, like for the creation of a space of encounter, and that was true of both Diego and myself, and I think of the people that came with the intentionality of share and link these histories, these seemingly disparate histories, into something that would allow us to make an intervention, which is what we wanted for the book. And I think that to the extent that it is possible to do so with these sort of projects, we do. And one aspect of this, as Diego was saying, is that usually biographies are, and this is something that was intentional, biographies are intended to examine what was supposed to be the characters, historical actors with intellectually and professionally defined histories that fit within specific boxes of official medicine. And what we understood very clearly from the go is that many of these vacuums that we were discussing in the literatures of healing practices in Latin America had to do with the fact that these post kind of marginal people were in reality, if not the majority, a large percentage of the people who were practicing medicine or practices related to healing in the region from the 16th century up to the 21st century. And that the trajectories of these people specifically would allow us to talk about not only histories of medicine and science, but also the history of Latin America itself in a different way. And that was a great opportunity here through that intervention, through telling these specific histories, and also underscoring the importance of these actors, right? Like of opening up that world. So it is intentional that it is biographies, not only as a way of saying these histories, these historical actors matter as well, but it's also to signal that it is through these personal histories that we can see those spaces that are not only outside of the histories of medicine, but also outside of many of the ways in which we analyze and think of more largely and periodize Latin American history. So there are supposedly in the margins or outside of official medicine, and part of this is also because of sources, as we will talk, I imagine later. But in reality, it is a matter of perspective. In many ways, they are at the center of the histories of the region. If you look at it and you focus and you train your historical tools on them.
Lisette, perhaps I would like to add something in the line of what Pablo just said, which is these biographies. We thought about these biographies, as a sort of stories. We put a lot of emphasis trying to convince all the contributors that we want to have a book that is easy to read, a book that somehow will engage the reader, with a narrative that is not saturated with references that are not really representative of how much the author manage and control the topic on which he or she is writing. So I want to emphasize that. It seems to me that, correct me, Pablo, if I'm wrong, probably not, that Pablo and myself, we are totally convinced that it's very important to write history that can reach a broader audience. And in order to do that, you have to write clearly, you have to somehow help the reader to understand what you are saying. And this is unfortunately a serious problem in academic writing. The idea that you are not committed to deliver a product that somehow will be easily absorbed by an undergraduate student, for instance.
I totally agree, Diego. And I will add also that this task is also intentional in trying to avoid sort of a large historiographical discussion. It is intentional also because the categories that dominate the historiography are really, we felt, not appropriate to talk about these women and men, the ones that we are talking. So in many ways, by trying to make an intervention and showing how these histories open up all these different narratives about the region, you're also trying to open a space that speaks and talks differently, right, about how and in what ways can we actually narrate, as Diego was saying, histories of medicine that are accessible, that are rich, and that are, again, as we were discussing, that even though they are coming from all over the place in Latin America, they do speak to each other in important ways.
And I think you did edit a book that is very accessible, that is read easily, and that is engaging. So I think you accomplished that goal wonderfully. But also you made very important interventions within the literature, right? So I really appreciate that as well. So now, I mean, you've told us about the title of the book, and it is so telling, right? This book is about these gray zones of medicine. Yeah, it's about health practitioners that thrive in a gray space between legality and criminality. You say this in the introduction. It's about the trajectories they follow and the interstitial spaces they inhabited. So I would like us to talk a little bit about those categories and dichotomies. So you tell us in the book that even though you use those dichotomies, you also are questioning them all the time. This book is also about questioning distinctions between Western and non-Western, or between learned medicine versus popular medicine, or between European, indigenous, African. You're saying that these distinctions are really hard to pinpoint or to maintain. And then there are some categories that, scholars have proposed to understand the relationship between medical systems such as hybridity, acculturation, appropriation, mestizaje. but that those words are also limited. So I wonder about how you manage and how you struggled with those categories, and how you also question them, even if at times you use them. So tell us a little bit about that, and perhaps the title is a good entry point into that question.
Yeah, thank you, Lisette. This is one of the things, again, and I think it was one of the parting points of those conversations that we had here in Madison. And it is the fact that we have, as we indicate in the book, a cornucopia of terms to talk, categorize, and somehow congeal in ways that become apparent. The results of these encounters, where they were coming, exchanges around healing cultures. And one of the things that it is true is that the limits of these analytical categories that somehow depend, right, like on identifying quote unquote traditional medical systems that can be contrasted to other broadly defined space that is called Western medicine. And we do know that that these terms are not only inappropriate, but in many cases they do violence to the histories of the people that we study, right? Like that there is not such a thing as a traditional, I don't know, muisca system that we can identify through a large historical trajectory, or an West African and West Central African. This is something that historiography has discussed as such, and that when we were talking about mestizo medical systems, so we're talking about all other sorts of mixtures, right, like hybridity, creolization. We still depart and think about like different degrees of mixture of these artificial labels somehow. And the other thing, that not to talk about the intersections between allopathic medicine, biomedicine, and other sorts of practices that when you examine the history that we have in this volume, you see that they're making almost ample use of practice coming from all these spaces, and depending on sort of epistemologies and ontologies, ways of being in the world and seeing the world that do not necessarily fit with these patterns, and that this is true not only of practitioners but also of clients, of patients themselves, right? Like the distinctions between Western and the Western that you were talking, learned medicine, popular medicine, they really do not talk about categories or somehow dynamics that really matter that much for the people that we're discussing. So this is why the gray zones here functions. So we're signaling that the porosity, the elastic borders that we were dealing with in the book. And finally, the other thing that I will say is that historically too, right, like the sort of narratives, right, like that we have in terms of the development of a certain kind of teleology, right, like that goes into some sort of more black and white space in the 20th century, where biomedicine is dominant. And I'll let Diego talk a little bit about this. It's also something that is artificial in nature, right? Like even today, right, like thinking about not only what is legal or illegal, but what is biomedical and not biomedical, does not speak about how health and health practices are deployed, right, like in spaces that are not defined by legality. And this is also something that became very evident, right, like with even during the past year with the COVID-19 pandemic. So I don't know if Diego wanna say something about that specific kind of central analytical space that we develop here.
Do you have a lot of subscriptions? I know that I do. And sometimes I will sign up for a free trial. Well, both with the subscriptions I have and the free trials I sign up for, sometimes I don't want them anymore, but it's really hard to cancel them. Well, this is sort of a scam. And the companies that offer these subscriptions make it hard to cancel them so they can get your money. Well, there's a way to stop them from getting your money when you don't want to give it to them, and that's to download Truebill. Is a new app that helps you identify and stop paying for subscriptions you don't need, want, or you simply forgot about. On average, people save up to $720 a year with Truebill. Truebill. Because companies make subscriptions hard to cancel, Truebill makes it incredibly simple. Just link your accounts and Truebill will cancel your unwanted subscriptions in one tap. And your Truebill concierge is there when you need them to cancel unwanted subscriptions so you don't have to. I've used Truebill and it works flawlessly. Over 2 million people use Truebill and it has helped them save over $100 million. So don't fall into subscription scams. Start canceling today at truebill.com/NBN. Go right now to truebill.com/NBN and it could save you thousands a year. Truebill.com/NBN.
Yes, yes, yeah, for sure. I would say that, and I would like to believe, that all the contributors in the book are on the same page as Pablo and myself on this, So I'm not going to include them, but I think that I can speak on behalf of Pablo and myself on this issue, We were a little bit tired of labels, so from the beginning, we have this sort of effort, to question, labels, and in that way we come up with the idea of the gray zone, These the dichotomies, organize medical practices, but not all of them are very well organized. Many of these dichotomies end up shaping corsets. And these are, after all, theoretical constructions, these dichotomies, these labels. And we know that theoretical constructions tend to simplify reality, to skip ambiguities, for instance. The Western, non-Western label, ignore processes of adjustments and negotiations. Spanish-European medicine crosses the Atlantic and confronts the new world that will influence the new settings and will be influenced by it. When doctors of the Rockefeller Foundation at the beginning of the 20th century wanted to define malaria in Brazil, for instance, they had to negotiate with local practitioners. Practitioners with university training or practitioners who have no university training at all. So what is coming out from these negotiations, the negotiation that we want to address in each chapter, is basically a hybrid product. And here again, we have to deal with theories and labels. You mentioned some of those labels. That's why I think that we decide to quote in the introduction, in one of the few quotes, Peter Burke, the great British historian, when he says that there is a sort of cornucopia of labels competing among them. At the end, what I think that we have is the mix, the negotiated and renegotiated healing practices that are at the very core of each chapter, of each story that this book offers. So somehow an effort to avoid labeling, an effort to deal with theory, but with a lot of common sense, and the sort of celebration of the mix, this sort of, again, gray zone.
And I will say one last thing here is that it also the parts this effort, the parts from a recognition of the something that we historians know very well, the limitations of the records that we have and how they actually portray a world that it was far more fluid, far more mixed, far more kind of in the in-betweens that both the legal, the colonial, the professional records that we use for our histories, which is what survive actually, will let us to believe. So the historians we also invite to be part of these projects are people that are very interested in reading in between and trying to recover those interstitial spaces themselves. So and trying to use what we have of historical records to do so.
Great. Let's question labels. I'm all down for that. So perhaps now we can talk about some of the chapters to kind of get a sense of what you're doing. And I would like us to start by talking about what each of you wrote. So perhaps we can start with Pablo, because it's the first chapter of the book, listeners, just to flag it to you. So you tell us the story of Domingo de la Ascensión, and you use this individual to talk about the criollo healing culture of the 17th century Caribbean. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about Domingo, who he was, why did you write about him here in this book, and I think it could be really useful for our non-historians audience. I hope there's a lot of non-historians listening to us. If you can explain how is it that we get to know so much about Domingo and about his healing practices? Why was he persecuted by the Inquisition, for example? Also, perhaps, Paulo, I hope I'm not making too many questions. I usually make too many questions, but why do you argue at the end of the chapter that Domingo's case demonstrate that the histories of healing that emerged from the Black cosmopolitan communities of the 17th century of Caribbean locales do not travel through the usual channels of the survival of African tradition? What is different from this story?
Well, thank you, Lisette. And I will try to be brief here. It's a lot of questions, but very interesting one and very important ones. I will say that I will start with the last question because it kind of links to what we were discussing before. And as I said before, I was interested in how is that what is produced in the 17th century Caribbean in terms of healing beliefs and practices, it is really a product of the region, of the exchanges happening in the region that do not depend on all world histories for their historiographical importance. And I use the term African inspirations both in my book and in this chapter to talk about not traditions per se, right? Like many of the people that I examine or that I talk about in the chapter are people that have been living in the Caribbean, in this case in Cuba, as it was the case of Domingo Ascension, for generations. So what was going on in the Caribbean that allow us to see a vibrant healing culture that does not uniquely needs to be defined in reference to West or West Central African narratives that, by and large, are built up on studies that come from the 19th, 20th century and through what Stefan Palmier called analytical interfaces that has to do with anthropology. Can we talk about a history that is Caribbean in nature, that depends on a blackness of the Caribbean, an Africanness or a blackness that does not need to go back to the Atlantic for legitimization? So that is what it was interesting for me and important about Domingo and that Criollo healing culture, that involves and incorporates practices that are being deployed there by people of European origin, Spaniards, but other multitude of Europeans that are arriving in the Caribbean, both from North and Central Europe, French, British, Dutch, and also the persistence of Amerindian traditions, both in Cuba and throughout the northern part of what today is South America, other Caribbean islands, and Mesoamerica. That this is a space that is in constant flux, that is only Spanish in the imagination of Spaniards. So that is what really this chapter is about. I would say that is one of the richest records that we have of any healer of African descent in the 17th century in general. And I will make that statement for the entire Atlantic. We don't have many records like these, and they are part of almost an historical accident, right? Which is the existence of the Holy Office, the Inquisition office in Cartagena de Indias that was founded in 1610 with the intention of prosecuting Protestants and people of Jewish descent or that were arriving in the Caribbean and that were part of a larger process of imperial / religious competition in the midst of the Counter-Reformation. But as a side product of these, you see the prosecution of what was considered to be dangerous practices, right? Or blasphemy. Many of the cases here are related to blasphemy or to heterodox practices that seem to be religious in nature, which is why we have the case of Domingo Ascension. Most cases here, as Domingo's one, were the result of professional competition, and in all likelihood, he ended up being there because of the denunciation of practitioners like barber surgeons that were seeing their clientele go to Domingo Ascension. And that was the case with many other healers of African descent in the region that ended up in front of the Inquisition. And it is very rare because sort of the Inquisition records, because they allow us to hear, even though they're somehow the words of these people are coming through the hand of an scribe in the Spanish colonial system, it is as close as we can get to their voices. We don't have records like this coming from other spaces in the Atlantic. Even for Brazil, many of the Inquisition cases of Brazil are, or the large processos de fe, they're coming from Portugal, not really from the Caribbean itself. So they depend on kind of a space where the accused have been living in that inquisitorial space for months before they actually appear in front of inquisitors. That is not the case in the Caribbean. In some cases, this is a matter of days and weeks before they actually speak. So it is really unique. These records are really unique, and they allow us to speak in ways that I don't think will be possible in other spaces about that word of healing and healing. And that is what I wanted to try. That's what I was trying to do with the chapter.
Yes, they are unique and they are wonderful and rich. And the chapter is just a wonderful story, listeners. So I really encourage you to go and read it. So maybe now we can move to Diego. And let's talk about Jesus Puello, the modern Argentine pastor of the 1930s and 1940s. So, Diego, tell us who was he and why did you write about him? One of the things that I found fascinating about this chapter is that although you write about a period in which biomedicine had emerged and gained a somewhat dominant status, though with our discussion about labels and these things, we have to question this dominancy of biomedicine. But here in this chapter, you're talking about tuberculosis in years in which there was a lot of biomedical uncertainty. And you're reminding us that uncertainty is always a part of medicine, as the COVID-19 pandemic also has made very clear. So tell us a little bit more about this and about the popular support that Jesus Puello's tuberculosis vaccine had. I also was very intrigued fascinated about the role of the press. Thinking again about sources as a historian, right? One of the striking difference, of course, between your chapter and that of Pablo is the sources you're each dealing with. And here in your story, the press is very important. But it's very important Puello's texts because he wrote and published his own side of the story, if you will. So tell us a little bit about the story, Diego, please.
Yeah, I think that you got it right. Yeah, it's if there is a core, yeah, in this story is the issue of uncertainty, a moment in which official medicine, yeah, biomedicine, yes, was not able to produce an efficient answer to a disease that has been killing people for decades. So we are in a moment, yeah, in the 1930s, 1940s, in which uncertainty somehow dominates the experience of tuberculosis for both physicians and also the sick. It is in this context, in the context of uncertainty, that I wanted to explore what is going on with initiatives that were coming from Buenos Aires, a very cosmopolitan city, but a city that was not at the very center of production of science in the 1940s. The very centers of production of science were in Europe and to a certain extent in the US. So here on the margins, yeah, what we have is these assistants, yeah, at the university, a microbiologist, yeah, who is making the point that he has an efficient cure for tuberculosis, a TB vaccine. Yeah. An important consideration here is that we have been dealing, yeah, with TB vaccines, yeah, since the end of the 19th century. Yeah. And all of these vaccines were not efficient. Yeah. So the context, yeah, is a good context, yeah, to come up with the idea that, yeah, this guy, Jesus Puello, a guy who was unable to finish his studies at the University of Buenos Aires, was ready to offer this solution for thousands of people suffering TB. So in this very uncertain context, what we have is this offering here, an offering that was almost immediately rejected by the establishment of the medical profession. Some doctors receive the vaccine with some kind of expectations, and even use the vaccine. But the establishment was very, very reactive, but were at the same time quite silent. Well, this is what? Another vaccine that somehow is promising a solution to tuberculosis, yeah, and quite soon will die out. The issue became very, very interesting when the press became an actor in the story of the polio vaccine in Buenos Aires, and to a certain extent in Argentina, but it was mainly Buenos Aires. An important issue here is what kind of press we are talking about. Yeah, we are talking about magazines and newspapers, very, very modern. Yeah, modern in the sense of very interested in offering to the reader engaging stories. Yeah, and also speaking. Yeah, on behalf of their readers. So here, what we have is the press. Yeah, somehow making a point that those who are suffering tuberculosis, yeah, are entitled to try with this vaccine that the establishment does not approve, yeah, but is innocuous, yeah, okay? So it is in this sort of very peculiar scenario in which we have, on the one hand, the establishment very reactive, yeah, to the vaccine. On the other hand, a Puello, a marginal voice in the scientific and medical circles of Buenos Aires, and a modern press extremely active, trying to use the novelty of the so-called Puello vaccine in order to do their own business, but also to speak on behalf of the poor tuberculars. Puello, time and again, tried to be part of the establishment, tried to be recognized and accepted by the establishment, but he didn't succeed. He even wrote a book, yeah, the book that was published, republished 6 times, yeah, and even I think that he paid for these editions, yeah, and the name that he chose, yeah, for the publishing house, yeah, was Ediciones Científicas. So this is clearly a guy who somehow was ostracized, yeah, by the medical establishment. And it was celebrated, yeah, by the sick, because the sick knew that the medical establishment up to that point was not able to deliver any convincing solution to their disease. Yeah. So here what we have is a story in which we have, in terms of historical sources, yeah, we have the press, printed media, we have the writing of the protagonist, the main protagonist, Jesus Puello, who writes in a sort of language that is the language of academia. It's the language of the physicians who are criticizing them, and out of this situation, also we have the voices of the sick. My last comment, just to finish with this. One of the things that I want to do when I write history of diseases, is to try to catch the voice of the sick. It seems to me that there is plenty of history of medicine, history of diseases, history of public health that somehow needs to incorporate the perspective of the sick. This event, the polio vaccine, the so-called Argentinian Pasteur, quote unquote, this is the way in which the sick were labeling, the sick and the journalists, of course, were labeling Puello, somehow help us to get closer, to how the sick, the patient, were living their diseases. And this is my final comment, I make distinction between patients and sick people. Patients are those who somehow are very, very well situated in the realm of official medicine. The sick could be in and out of the official medicine, alternative solutions, proposals, and so on.
Thank you. Those are very useful points, I think, for thinking about the history of medicine in a broad sense. So, of course, we cannot cover every chapter of this book, especially because we want to leave something for our listeners to go and find out when they buy the book. So I'm going to drop or throw out there 2 big themes I see present in the book. And I encourage you to talk to, whatever speaks to you. So first, and because I am interested in, my work is about female practitioners and gender. So first, that is the first topic I'm thinking about. And we have to talk about women and gender. And the contributors of the book, many of them talk about women, female practitioners, healers. So what were the roles of women in these gray zones of medicine? Can you think of a chapter that, I don't know, that sparked your your interest a lot and you want to share with our listeners. And then the second topic is race, right? This is very general, but in this volume, you're dealing with racialized subjects in a way, subjects that, I mean, that are prosecuted differently because of the race, or that experience healing different because they are racialized. And I just wonder if there's any chapter that you think you can think of, and you think our listeners will find useful or interest. And just to clarify, of course, these two categories are not independent; they work together, as many of the chapters actually illustrate. So, but I just wonder what do you think of these two topics?
So I can start answering this question, and maybe Diego, if he wants, he can complement. Uh, Gender, of course, was something that was very important for us, and I think partially one of the ways in which the book traverses and goes beyond the sort of limitations imposed precisely by the categories that we were discussing before. And going beyond those categories allow us to see how many of these actors in these spaces that, as I mentioned before, make up what for me are kind of the larger histories of healing practice, the larger histories of ideas about the body in Latin America, and I will say more largely in the world, really, are not only they have women as protagonists on both sides, both as practitioners themselves, but also as part of the community that is shaping those ideas themselves. And this is very evident in several of the chapters that we have. I will signal, but I will point out to three of these chapters. Chapter 12, the chapter on Doña Emilia Diego, which is a Zapotec healer and entrepreneur and a social activist in modern Mexico. This is a history that is contemporary in nature. It's a chapter by Gabriela Soto Laveaga, and that speaks in many ways to the same concerns, right, that we have about this woman that is traversing the political, social, and professional space in ways that would have been unrecognizable. We were just thinking about only the legality and illegality of certain aspects of medical practice themselves, right? Or if we were thinking about healing practices only from the point of view of what we consider to be biomedicine itself, a trajectory that doesn't put her into just one narrative, right, about a professional physician being involved in the founding of a specific medical practices in Mexico itself. This is not Doña Emilia, and yet Doña Emilia Diego, I think, is a history that is much more important and representative than many of the biographies of 20th century doctors in Mexico itself. Same thing can be said about the chapter about Adam Warren and Doña Dorotea Salguero, and competition and the large following that she had in early Republican Peru. Histories that are usually told about the Facultad de Medicina in San Marcos, for instance, and prosecution of unlicensed, usually male practitioners. So the fact that we have the case of Dorotea Salguero here, even with the limited information, opens up a world that we don't usually see, and a different set of not only of patients but also of practice that also gender in nature. It is also, for instance, the case of Maria Garcia, that many of this is the indigenous healer in 18th century Guatemala that Martha Few talks about. It is many of the patients of these women were women themselves. So if we don't pay attention to these narratives, to these biographies, to these spaces, we also miss that larger world. This is, and the final thing that I will say about this specific aspect of your question, they said, is that these histories, especially the case of Emilia Diego and Dorotea, also kind of ask us to walk away from the idea that woman healers only heal women or only important for that space. That this is not the case for Emilia or for Dorotea. Their practices, they go beyond those gender binaries and other categorization that we wanted also to go beyond. At the same time that, for instance, the case of Domingo de la Ascensión or the spaces of Calundu, examined by Jim Sweet in chapter 3, involve practitioners and communities made both of women and men. So just wanted to emphasize this. Now, about ethnicity, and this I'm going to be brief because Obviously, ethnicity and representations of ethnicity, as I was mentioning before in my answers, are at the core of what we examine here and how we historiographically categorize these people. So Jim Sweet's chapter talking about Kalandu and the long history of Kalandu challenges preconceptions about the emergence of these Afro-Atlantic religious complexes and healing concepts in relationship with ideas about Africanness, Blackness, especially because Brazil and in many cases people of European descent, nuns sometimes, as a matter of fact, were also participants in various early 18th and 19th century spaces of the formation of Calundu as a practice. The work of Alberto Ortiz, Mauricio Gaston also talks of the complexities of thinking about Blackness in a 20th century Caribbean and Dominican Republic that is racist on its own, right? Like in which Blackness has different contours than the ones that we usually assume it has, especially in South America or Mesoamerica. And the same can be said about the work of Victoria Estrada and Jorge Marquez Valderrama, talking about the representation of indigeneity in her examination of the healer Indio Rondin in early 20th century Colombia, and the many facets of both ethnicity and the importance of assuming that ethnicity in the crafting of healing practices, or the case of a Chinese healer and their patients and those communities that are created in Lima, in Peru, in the late 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century, who are the practice, how ethnicity becomes a part of, again, ideas about the materiality of medicine itself, how it is embraced, but it also creates spaces of discrimination, but also professional opportunities, and how practitioners and patients themselves move around and in between these categories. So as you were saying, Lisa, this is at the center of the book, and it is in many ways, as I was saying before, part of those elastic categories that both practitioners, healers, and patients traverse in ways that might not seem to be evident, at least in the ways that they have been portrayed in other narratives of the history of medicine in Latin America. I don't know if Diego wants to add something to this.
Yes. So gender and race. Perhaps I will be an old-fashioned historian, but I would like to also include class. Yeah.
And, great. Yeah. That's a great addition. Yes, I agree.
And I will do it. Yeah, just focusing on the cover of the book. Actually, we decided to use this cover. I like a lot. Yeah, it's a painting by José Guadalupe Posada. Yeah, that is included in the chapter written by Jetro Hernández Berrones about Francisco Madero. Yes, the Madero, the president, who used to be a practitioner of homeopathy. And the illustration of Guadalupe Posada is a very, very telling illustration. Yeah. Here what we have is the house with a big sign on top of the entrance of the house who says médico, cirujano, partero, alópata y homeópata. But the most interesting thing is that all the guys who are trying to get into this house are coming from very different social sectors. You have the typical peasant, yeah. We have women from the bottom of society, women from the elite. We have people who look like professionals, emerging middle classes, yeah, and so on. The point that I want to make is that what happened with these practitioners, yeah, in the gray zone, yeah, is not just something that is relevant for the poor, those who have less resources, yeah, to access to the official institution of university medicine. Back in the 17th century, or even today, what we have is that these practitioners, these healings, yeah, are part of the life of both people from the elite and people from the poor sectors of society. Yeah, in different circumstances, in different contexts, they might be using this as a resource, yeah, to take care of their health. Yeah. So along with race and gender, again, let's keep in mind that both wealthy people and low-income people, yeah, centuries ago and in the present, also have these healers, as part of their horizon, in terms of potential health providers.
Can I add just one last thing here that I think is important, and it is the fact that what Diego has mentioned about the chapter of Gieto Hernandez is also true about the chapters by Lene Marie Bertucci about healers in Sao Paulo and the pharmacies and herbs, roots, and amulets that are being sold in these spaces, and they believe in people like San Vicente that go beyond those usual lines that we ascribe, and even the chapter by George Ferreis in the biography of Domingo Sodres, a very, very important famous healer that was enslaved himself in Rio de Janeiro, right? So that clientele and the narratives that they are creating, they go beyond those distinctions that, as Diego has mentioned, seem to focus, ideas about quote unquote popular medicine. People without important economic resources. That was not true, and I think that in addition to talking about ethnicity, gender, class is also something that goes through many of the contributions here.
Thank you, Diego, for adding that. It's very important, and you're right that that's what you're pointing us towards with the cover of the book, which is really nice. Listeners, Google it. So I've taken too much of your time, and I think we've covered a lot of ground, and listeners have had the chance to experience the richness of this volume. But I cannot let you go without asking the COVID question, the pandemic question. So it must have been a little bit surreal writing this book and editing it, writing the chapters, editing this book while everything was happening around you. So I'm thinking about these gray zones of medicine that continue to exist today, as you've been telling us in this interview. And I don't know, you've mentioned, they've become more salient in a way visible perhaps for some. So I'm thinking about those people who have decided to not be vaccinated because they don't trust the science and they have chosen other remedies. And I'm also thinking about ivermectin, which in the last few weeks I've read a lot of things about ivermectin and alternative treatments that people have defended, even if health boards or centers for disease control have stated that they are not effective and that can even be dangerous. So what can you tell us about, I don't know, these perils of these gray zones of medicine? I don't know if I would call it that, but what you're thinking when you were writing this book and like living this pandemic that has changed our lives?
I would say that it was indeed surreal to write for many, many, many reasons, right? Like to write this book in the midst of the pandemic, but I think it fits perfectly well within this narrative. And it actually, what seems to many of us in academia or that work and live in the medical world, I myself was trained as a physician. My wife is a physician, as it is the case also for Diego. Sometimes we tend to believe in the all-encompassing, somehow life-changing ways in which biomedicine creates and structures our world. But biomedicine has never existed outside of the trajectories and social spaces that we historicize in this book. And this is because of what constitutes healing and healing cultures is not only about the body, but encompasses everything, all aspects of life, right? Like, and that is the political, the social, the cultural. Embodiment is the flesh itself materializes all these aspects that we seem to believe are they exist in different realms. So the ways in which we conceive of biomedicine as explaining corporality so efficiently tends to forget that it only explains certain aspects of corporality that might not be convincing in other ways to people, right? Like that people have other ways to understand and feel and see the world. And the other thing is that biomedicine or science in general, right? It never actually was intended to provide answer to the big questions of the whys, right? Like it is in many ways is processual in nature, is interested in talking about phenomena and what are the best ways of proceeding, not with final answers, right? Like, but with what we think of as specific ways, pragmatic ways of dealing with the instances of the consequences of the larger big questions that people are interested in.
Yes, in certain areas of the world, we have a very, very strong opposition to vaccines, not everywhere. And I would say that this is perhaps a very peculiar phenomenon of a moment, a social and cultural moment in which important sectors of society are becoming quite skeptic of science. But this is not always the same. I mean, this is something that is very peculiar of this time, the beginning of the 21st century. If I return to my chapter, the tuberculars were desperate to get the polio vaccine because they want to believe that that was a solution. The point that I want to make is that we cannot deal with these issues now, issues that are somehow dominating our life in the context of the pandemic, as something that has been the same throughout history. Pandemics in plural are not particularly useful as a way to understand the relationship between the environment and society and culture. We have to talk about specific pandemic and not pandemics in general. So that's this is perhaps the strong point that I want to make, Lisette. Yes, we are dealing with the COVID, but this is one pandemic, and this is quite different, than the way in which other societies in different times have been dealing with novelties coming from science or coming from the gray zones. So, this issue of continuity, no doubt, but changes, within this continuity.
Yeah, and I want to just emphasize what Diego says there, right? Like, I think the point here is that biomedicine, right, like it is also exists within that continuity, right? Like, but that it has to be contextualized. It is part of a process of answers, right? Like that, of which we have had, as Diego is saying, we need to put into that historical space every time we're thinking about him historically, right? Like, but that it has not provided kind of a definitive answer to these processes, and the same thing can be said about pandemics.
Wonderful. I think there's a lot of food for thought in those answers. So thank you. Thank you for those reflections. I mean, lastly, just to say goodbye, before I let you go, what are you working on right now? What are your current projects?
I'm finishing, actually next year, will come out a book on Buenos Aires, published by Duke, part of the Buenos Aires Reader, the World Cities collection, So this is something that I was working a lot in the last years. I'm currently also working on a cultural and social history of cigarette smoking in modern Buenos Aires. What else? Next year, Fondo de Cultura Económica, and Pablo, this is something that you don't know. Fondo de Cultura Económica will publish a similar book to The Gray Zone, but focus only on Argentina, from mid-19th century to the present. Not sure about the title, perhaps will be Híbridos Argentinos, Pasado y Presente en las Artes de Curar. So I have these three projects on my table.
And Lisette, I've been working during the past few years on a couple of projects, book project that is examining how the history of the slave trade and the epistemologies of the slave trade are fundamental for thinking in terms of both risk and numbers, right? Like, and calculation of a disease that precede political arithmetics and demographic and epidemiological narratives of the late 17th and 18th century and 19th century, that is examining the larger world of both the Mediterranean and Atlantic slave trade as a space for the creation of particular types of knowledge that are related to the emergence of biomedicine itself and science as it relates to the body. So that is one of the projects, and that is one that has been occupying a lot of my time. I'm also working on a couple of projects, one in the reimagination of the contours of global histories of science, medicine, and technology. This is kind of a larger editorial project in which